Hey, good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining from. My name is James Anderson. I'm an associate here at the World Resources Institute and part of the Cities for Forests team. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on financing green and gray infrastructure, featuring Todd Gardner. We are recording this webinar and we will share the slides afterwards. So don't worry about taking detailed notes. We'll have it available for you soon, and we'll also share it with those that are unable to join the webinar today. Right now, we're going to keep everybody on mute while we go through the initial stage of the presentation. If you have any questions or any comments, stories you'd like to share, we'd like this to be interactive. Just feel free to add something to the chat box. There's a little Zoom webinar chat box, and I'll unmute you and call on you so you can ask or share your thoughts. So thanks very much. I'd like to just very quickly run through the folks that have joined us today. It looks like we've got a diverse set of people joining from various cities around the world, including a few folks from the WRI team. But let's see here. We've got Marina, I believe, from Sao Paulo. We've got Rachel from LA. We've got Catherine from the P4G partnership. We've got Gabrielle joining from Campinas. And we've got David Wood joining from, I'm not sure where. So we're glad to have you here, David, and feel free to write a message in if you are representing a city or an organization. We've also got a few folks from the Cities for Forests team on the line here, including Sabin Ray, Lisa Beyer, and John Rob Poole, not to mention Todd Gardner, who I will introduce in just a minute. Oh, great. Thanks, David. David just wrote in the message that he's with Econ and calling from Charleston, South Carolina. So welcome, David. Glad to have you. And we expect a few other folks to join in just the next few minutes. So Todd, would you mind advancing through the first slide here? Great, I'll just give a quick introduction. I think all of you are already familiar with Cities for Forests. That's why you're on the call here, but just a very quick recap. The reason that we're all here, of course, is that trees and forests are immensely valuable to cities and their residents. And that is why the Cities for Forests partnership has brought together this group of cities, experts, financiers, and others to try and do more to conserve, manage, and restore forests at these three different scales that you can see on the slide here. That includes both the inner forests, such as city trees and urban parks, nearby forests, such as green corridors and watershed areas, and faraway forests as well. Those that might not be within a day's drive of the city, but still provide essential services for it, such as carbon storage, rainfall generation, and so forth. Next slide, please. As you probably also know, Cities for Forests has grown into this great wide-ranging partnership of cities with 60 participating municipalities across 6 continents. We've got a huge diversity represented here today, and a number of really active cities from all over the world. And what we do at the Cities for Forests Secretariat is help really to connect these cities, which are the heart of the project. And provide assistance and guidance navigating the various tools that are available out there, hosting convenings and forums and workshops, peer exchanges, providing scientific advice, policy guidance, expert guidance on residents' engagement and communications, and of course, financing, which is the topic of today's webinar. Next slide, please. Great. So for this slide, let me pass it over to Todd Gardner. Todd is the Director of Cities for Forest and WRI's Natural Infrastructure Initiative. He leads a multidisciplinary team here with a mission to better conserve, manage, and restore forests, working landscapes, urban green infrastructure, et cetera. Todd has been with WRI for quite some time and built the program here. His previous work includes work at the American Forest Foundation, forestry work in New England, bioecology and ecotourism research in Botswana and India, business consulting for the USDA Forest Service, and years as a corporate financial consultant. So he's got a lot of expertise to offer, and many of you already know him well. He's based in Portland, Oregon, and if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of the birds singing in his backyard. So, he's already taking advantage of the forest resources in his area. So Todd, I'll hand it over to you. And again, if any of the panelists have any questions, feel free to add it in the chat window, and I'll make sure that your voice is heard. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, James. Can you hear me clearly and okay?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Well, again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As James mentioned, I am calling in from my home in Portland, Oregon, which is also a city participating in the Cities for Forests initiative. Excited to be having this conversation with you all today. And for me, it's important to think about this as really our first touch point as it relates to funding and finance and the Cities for Forests initiative. What I really hope to do is provide a relatively quick overview of some of the exciting financing mechanisms and funding approaches that several of the cities that are part of the initiative are beginning to take advantage of. Some of the lessons that we've learned, how that process began, and ultimately then kind of drive the conversation towards what does this mean for your cities and your priorities. And inevitably, webinars are difficult formats to have really in-depth discussions. So please see this as just the beginning of what will hopefully be a number of follow-up, more in-depth and personalized conversations. And always feel free to poke me and poke any of our colleagues to learn more about any of these, to be put in touch with any of the cities that we highlight who are doing this incredible work, and really figure out how we can help your city access additional funds and finance to scale your forestry and green infrastructure type work. The working group around finance, as you see on the screen, is really ultimately oriented to do just that, to share successes, but also to share things that maybe didn't go quite as well, so that when we're working with your city, at least we can make new and different mistakes and really learn from the trials and tribulations of other cities as part of the network. We're very much oriented to trying to provide as much technical assistance as possible, open up doors, connect you with potential investors, financiers, funding opportunities, keep you up to date as new opportunities come online, but also really hear from you. What do you as a city kind of in this space every day, what do you need to be successful? What are the challenges that you're seeing that we might together help you overcome to get where you're going bigger, better, and faster? As James mentioned, at any time, please just put any questions in the chat box. I'm going to spend about 12 to 15 minutes running through a couple of case studies and some of the approaches, and then I'd love to open it up for discussion and questions. So assuming that sounds all right, I'm gonna dive right in. And we're very intentionally talking about funding and financing, and I'd like to describe sort of what I mean by that, and how we think about not just the sources of those funds and financing, but often the sequencing that needs to take place to get from what is often a small scale project funded by philanthropy or foundations to something in the tens of millions of dollars where there's truly private sector investment. And you see on the screen now sort of that 4-step process. And a lot of times these happen in parallel, or one skip is sort of not part of the process. But philanthropy, grants, corporate social responsibility, oftentimes those dollars are really to help cities and their partners get started, to do some of the analysis to understand what return on investment might look like, what the enabling conditions are, and there isn't an expectation that that money will be paid back. So a lot of the pilot projects that we see have been started through that philanthropic dollars. What we are seeing more and more of in today's funding landscape are institutions, a lot of foundations, both in the US, in Latin America, Europe, et cetera, who are not necessarily just giving free money, grants that doesn't have to be paid back. They are anticipating that the money that they lend will be paid back, but at very, very low interest rates. So sometimes 0% or 1%. And this is really to test these types of approaches, reduce the level of risk, and ideally try to move these projects to the point where they can access what we call market rate capital. And that is, investments and loans that will be paid back with a rate of return that is consistent with what you might see in other spaces. And some of those types of mechanisms are highlighted in the red box here. And what I'll do over the next 10 to 12 minutes is work through a few of those examples. All of these sort of stepwise approaches are to get us to that ultimate goal of scale, where the idea of nature-based solutions and the integration of green and gray resources really is the new normal. And when major banks, whether it's the World Bank or Goldman Sachs or B&AS or IDB, what have you, that they are legitimately investing in this stuff alongside dams and dikes and treatment plants and other types of hard infrastructure. There is, in some cases, a assumption that has proven itself not to be true, that the limiting factor in financing green infrastructure or natural infrastructure is the lack of dollars available. And when you look at the research that is out there, somewhat surprisingly, that does not tend to be the biggest obstacle. In fact, there is more money sitting on the sidelines. That means that investors have the money ready to direct towards green type projects. They feel that they just can't find enough good projects where they can actually direct that money. If you talk to cities, if you talk to project developers, especially in emerging economies in the developing world, they say, well, we have all these projects. How do we connect the dots and access all this money that is sitting on the sidelines? That is part of what we really hope to accomplish through Cities for Forests and the partnerships and collaboration. Make those connections and understand the mechanisms that would actually allow that capital to flow to your projects, work from a small scale to major scale implementation. One of the most common ways that we see this type of financing and capital being deployed, and one of the areas that is growing most quickly in this space, is around green bonds. So many cities, many utilities, especially in the water space, finance a lot of their infrastructure already using what we call debt financing. You're borrowing money and paying it back over time through the issuance of bonds or similar type approaches. In recent years, there's been what's called the emergence of a green bonds approach. And as it relates to the water sector, and there are similar green bonds for forestry, for hydroelectric production, et cetera, is looking at three things. One, making sure that any water project is not just looking at the impacts at the project level, but really looking at how the proceeds from the bond issuance will be used and how it will impact the entire watershed. So making sure there's no unintended consequences for other services that we all care about. It also looks to verify that the use of proceeds will have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to other alternatives. So at a minimum, it's equal emissions. Ideally, this nature-based approach reduces the level of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then third, and really importantly, there needs to be what we call an adaptation or resiliency plan. So any use of proceeds needs to come with some understanding of how the infrastructure will function in the face of more floods, more droughts, just levels of uncertainty in the face of climate change. And we have seen California out on the west coast of the US take advantage of this to a pretty incredible degree. San Francisco Public Utilities Commission has issued nearly 200 million worth of green bonds over the last number of years, and they are starting to move beyond just built infrastructure to look at stormwater management and water supply and how green infrastructure fits into their bond issuances. It is not just the US. Cape Town, which unfortunately was looking at a day zero water reality where they wouldn't have enough water for their millions of residents, issued a green bond for water, thinking about, again, how to think about the soft nature-based side alongside the built environment. And much further east in China, they've also done a lot of green bond issuances around protection, water security for their literally billions of residents. This actually is a little bit outdated. It's over $2 billion was the level of issuance in the first 24 months, but just 2 months ago in May, the Dutch government issued a nearly $10 billion green bond, of which $5 to $6 billion was oriented towards the water sector, and a third of that had nature-based solutions incorporated into it. So by far the largest issuance to date, and I imagine that this trajectory will continue growing in the years to come. Moving from San Francisco, which is one city in our network, highlighting some incredible innovation and testing that's going on with another city, Little Rock, Arkansas. We are partnering with Little Rock, Arkansas and the Central Arkansas water utility down there. Now, question, of course, is if you borrow money, how do you pay that money back, right? You need to figure out how you pay investors back with an interest on top of the principal, and that's where a lot of cities and utilities get hung up, understandably so. And so this project is just kicking off, but we are thinking about potentially issuing a green bond that would make capital available upfront, which would allow the city and the utility to immediately begin implementing some of their priorities within the watershed or nearby forest. Protecting key forest land, restoring riparian areas along core river areas, enhancing the management around their drinking water reservoir. And the land is only going to get more expensive in the years and decades to come. So even though at first glance, if they borrow the money, wow, that's a lot of money, we're gonna have to pay that back, it only gets more complicated and more expensive the longer that they wait. So they would have access to capital to do the work now. And then there are a couple of ways that they're thinking about paying back those investors over time at a very reasonable interest rate. One would be sustainable wood harvesting from the properties that they would own or manage or otherwise have access to. There's real dollars there that can be generated. They would potentially supplement that with forest-based carbon credits. They could manage in such a way to be eligible on the California Climate Exchange and generate real dollars, especially since these lands will likely be protected in perpetuity, which makes them very much eligible for the emerging carbon markets. And then finally, because of the work that they're doing and the level of protection and enhancement of water quality, they are looking at increasing a slight rate surcharge on the water bill so that the residents who are dramatically benefiting from the enhanced water quality and water security and will therefore see lower water bills in the future are paying a little bit upfront now to make sure that those benefits are achieved. And if you look at those three types of repayment options, you start to get to the level where it does make sense to think about borrowing money upfront, really a win-win scenario for the city and its residents. One thing that we often see is multiple agencies within a city having similar goals, but not necessarily having the governance structures or planning and investment platforms to work together to do things at a much grander scale. And in San Francisco, we are working to try to address that issue. It is a project called a Joint Benefits Authority. And it's really quite simple. We're looking at priority hectares of land within the city. I apologize, there's an airplane flying overhead right now. And if we manage any given acre for stormwater benefits by implementing green infrastructure, there are a number of other city agencies that also benefit. The Department of Transportation, because of the reduced flooding, sees their road infrastructure protected. The Health Department would see benefits to air quality and water quality. The Public Works Department would see efficiency in how it does the work on the ground. We're even talking to the Education Department about potentially citing some of this work on school grounds to engage the youth of the city, and very much looking to implement this type of approach in areas of the city that have lower income residents and underserved populations, so that we can really begin to address some of the environmental equity issues that we often see. So the Joint Benefits Authority is an effort to do advanced capital planning where all of the agencies sit down now, align their priorities both spatially and quantitatively, look for areas where they can all invest in the same hectares of green infrastructure so that everybody gets their mandates met, but it costs them dramatically less and there's greater efficiency than if they did that alone. We have kicked this off in San Francisco and are beginning to have conversations in Seattle and a number of other cities, both in the US and ideally in Africa and Latin America as well. And would love to discuss these types of approaches with you and your partners within the city agencies. Moving from flooding and green infrastructure within the city, I'm now going to talk about what's happening in many of our rural forest areas where there's unfortunately an increase in large, what we call catastrophic wildfires across the US. And even though this example is a US example, we're actually having conversations with folks in Chile right now. Same as in Indonesia, where there are huge wildfire issues that are getting worse every year. And how might they think about innovative finance to begin to address those issues? This project is called the Forest Resilience Bond, and we've piloted it again in California. And I recognize that many of these examples are California-based, and soon I will pivot over to Latin America and other emerging regions of the globe. But in this area, we have overstocked forests, so too many trees. It's a little bit different than a lot of other places where they're looking to put more trees on the landscape. And so that means when there are fires, which are happening more frequently because of climate change and droughts and dead trees and the like, they burn bigger and more intense and have many more consequences for downstream residents. So last year, unfortunately, was the largest wildfire year on record in California. We had over 100 people that unfortunately perished in those wildfires, and billions of dollars of infrastructure that was destroyed, from pipelines, supply systems, homes, bridges, roads, etc. Not to mention the greenhouse gas emissions and water quality concerns. What we're doing, it's very similar in some ways to the bond concept that I described, is we are having investors provide upfront capital. And I'll talk about that capital a bit more in just a second. That capital then goes to do restoration in the forest. So forest management, controlled burning, and that work reduces the risks of wildfire and the consequences to downstream beneficiaries. Those beneficiaries, such as the water utility, the state of California, the health department, and a number of others, including the US Forest Service, then pay back those investors once the work is complete. So none of those beneficiaries, the utility or the Forest Service or the state, has all of the money up front, even though the timing is critical that we do the work now. So we borrow private capital, the work gets done. As the work gets done and the risk is reduced, those downstream then pay the investors back. The first project was just under $5 million and covered 15,000 acres, or about 7,500 hectares, and the work is underway. The rate of return is divided into what we call two tranches of capital. So in the first slide, I talked about concessionary capital. Well, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Moore Foundation are foundations, and they are willing to accept a 1% return to see this work get done in the North Yuba River watershed. On the other side of the axis, AAA Insurance and Calvert Impact Capital are going to be receiving a 4.5% return. And this is per annum over 5 years. If you put those together, if you aggregate the two together, you're looking at about a 3.8 blended return on investment, which is very similar to what a utility might pay if they did a traditional loan for hard infrastructure. So oftentimes people say that green infrastructure and natural systems, it's just more expensive. This case is one example where it's very much aligned in terms of risks and rewards relative to other investments a city or a utility might make. Another type of financing approach that we've begun to see become more common is this idea of pay for success or pay for performance. And one of the challenges of green infrastructure over the years has been the relative uncertainty or presumed uncertainty around how it will perform. Many engineers rightfully say if we build the new treatment plant, when we turn that switch on, we know what it will accomplish in terms of filtration and treatment and the like. If we build bioswales, if we restore a forest or a river system, there is uncertainty around how that nature-based solution will perform. There's a little bit of uncertainty around the timing. You can't just plant a tree and expect it to be fully functional from day one. So some utilities and some investors have begun to look at, well, what if our investment and return strategy was at least in part based on the actual performance of the green infrastructure? And this is something that in Washington, D.C., the Stormwater Management Agency, DC Water, looked to test out. So what they did, and I know that there's a lot on this slide, and again, we will share this with you, is they did have what's called a consent decree, which is basically a regulation that said that they needed to do a better job of managing their stormwater. And they had a couple of different options. They could have spent hundreds of millions of dollars and built the gray infrastructure right away. But they really thought that the green infrastructure could accomplish the same thing as just the built systems. But they wanted to prove that out. So in a slightly smaller pilot example, they tested that approach. And they modeled out what the outcomes, what the ecological outcomes would be of the green infrastructure. And they said if the results fit within the 90% expected return in terms of ecological benefits, then we're going to pay about 3.5% return to our investors. And that will then mean that we will do the full-scale green infrastructure. If it overperforms, so it does even better than was modeled, they're actually going to pay the investors more, which sounds a little counterintuitive, I know, but the good news is it then would trigger full-scale implementation of green infrastructure. So in the long run, they would save tens of millions of dollars, even though they're paying a slight premium to investors now. And that's to encourage investors to seek out good projects, and it's to encourage the utility to really follow through. Now, if it underperforms, if we don't see the stormwater and nutrient benefits to the level that was modeled, then the utility pays investors less than the 3.5%. And now they're paying less in the short run, but that means that they're going to have to build the gray infrastructure, and that will cost them tens of millions of dollars more. So I know that that can be confusing, but again, we can come back to any of this. So all of the things that I've highlighted, and there are many more that we're working on, we are capturing in a soon-to-be released financing database. And so it's going to be a searchable or queryable database where you can search for financing approaches for stormwater, or financing approaches for water security, or carbon sequestration, or disaster risk management. And you can also see, well, I'm interested in what's happening, what be applicable in India, or in Latin America, or sub-Saharan Africa. And it'll allow you to do that. It will provide you links to case studies where this has happened. It will connect you with investors, or identify investors who have made investments in this space, identify key lessons learned, and the like. And what we hope to do in the fall, in the autumn, is work with many of you to test out the database and see how we can improve it and make it more usable for your needs. So that will be coming in the next couple of months. Most, if not all, of the examples that I gave are pilots or examples from the Western context, mostly from the US, even though we are seeing green bonds in other places. What we're really trying to do, in addition to seeing even more successes in the US and Europe, is think through how we can make this as valuable, contextual as possible for our cities in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. And that is where partnerships with the World Bank, with the IDB, African Development Bank, and even our institutional financiers comes into play. And we were already beginning to test these types of approaches in places like Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and Nairobi, Kenya. So, and part of that is through the generosity of the FEMSA Foundation, which is a foundation of Coca-Cola and Heineken bottling in Latin America, who have provided resources to Cities for Forests to really test out many of these approaches in Latin America. For example, in Mexico City, we are looking at stormwater management and what types of financing approaches would help accomplish their goals there. There are, I believe, 17 areas called the Pocket Park Program that over the last number of years, those areas have become a bit abandoned and derelict. Actually, there's some crime that occurs in those areas. How do we turn those areas that are not particularly attractive right now, and they're a liability for the city, into an asset? How do we think about financing green infrastructure so they provide those stormwater benefits and air quality benefits, but then also serve as a community meeting place so we can bring the residents of Mexico City together? That is something that we are currently working on right now. We also just launched a report with the World Bank that looks specifically at this issue, green and gray infrastructure, not just for water, but also for disaster risk management. And many of the examples, and we're happy to share this resource with everyone on the line and in the network, digs in deep to examples in Vietnam and Sri Lanka, parts of China, in Colombia, etc. So this is not just happening in the US. We are starting to see it happen in other places too. But it's not just about the finance. We need to understand the other pieces of the equation too. What does management of a good green infrastructure project look like? What have we learned from 2 decades of testing? How do we make sure the right partners are at the table? How do we monitor the results? How do we share the lessons learned? Those are all things that we've begun to dive into as part of this network, and we're really looking to understand from you, what have you learned? What do you need? Who do you want to talk to? How can we help you get where you're trying to go? And one of the things, again, going back to that, one of the first slides about capital not being the limiting factor, we are working to try to develop what we're calling a project preparatory facility. And we're talking to many of the large financial institutions like the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, IDB, the GEF, et cetera. Can we find dedicated capital in the hundreds of millions of dollars that would be oriented to helping cities and utilities do some of the early stage feasibility analysis, especially in our developing country cities and emerging country cities, to really prove that these projects are what we call, quote unquote, bankable, that they are appealing to investors. And so part of that is doing an economic analysis. If you simply default to gray infrastructure and build that next reservoir and do the interbasin transfer, build that treatment plant, that may cost you hundreds of millions of dollars and will have very few co-benefits in terms of jobs for rural residents, sequestration benefits, habitat benefits, and the like. What if you do an integrated approach and you have not just gray, but green and gray? What might the cost savings be? What are the co-benefits? How does that play itself out in dollars and cents? And I believe one of our colleagues from Sao Paulo is on the line. We recently launched a report with a number of partners that looked specifically at this issue. We all know some of the challenges Sao Paulo had in 2014, 15, and 16 with the drought. They're taking their water management very seriously, water security. What if they increase their focus on restoring Mata Atlantica, the Atlantic forest, an incredibly beautiful area, to prevent erosion, to enhance water security, etc. Well, we did an analysis with partners on the ground that said, if they strategically restored parts of the forest, there was a high likelihood of a positive return on investment and major cost savings, let alone all of the other economic and social benefits that would be generated. We are doing something very similar in Victoria in Brazil and in Monterrey, Mexico. We've also launched a recent study in Rio de Janeiro. So again, these are not just Western US European examples. We are truly seeing real economic returns all across the globe. And our goal is to do these types of analysis with our cities, connect our cities with other partners who can do it, and help connect to investors so that you can finance and fund your priorities and make your infrastructure as resilient as possible in the face of climate change and increased urbanization. And so with that, I'd love to kind of turn now to a discussion, answer any questions that have come up. I know that is a lot of dense material in a short period of time. Lots and lots of details were left out. Fortunately, all of the different case studies and approaches that I mentioned, we have very detailed write-ups and lessons on those examples, how they got started, who was involved, what it might mean for others. And we are very well positioned to take these success stories and lessons learned and work with you to understand in Sao Paulo, in Campinas, in other places, LA, how and which mechanism is most appropriate. What does a work plan look like to begin putting this in place? And how do we get the right folks to the table to make this a reality? So I'm going to pause and maybe pass back to James. I'm not sure if any questions have come in. Either way, I'd love others to ask questions, either clarifications on anything that I mentioned, or as importantly, questions on how this might be relevant for you and your partners in your city. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Todd. This is James again. I don't see any questions in the chat window yet, so the floor is wide open. I invite any of you to either signal in the chat there that you'd like to ask a question or contribute something to the discussion. You should also have the ability to unmute yourself. If not, feel free to send a message, and I'm happy to unmute you.
Don't be shy, folks. Well, look, we know that webinars are an imperfect mechanism to have meaningful conversation, to get in deep. So I would encourage folks to send me an email, reach out to the WRI representative who is partnering closely with your city with any questions that you have. Share the projects you're working on that really need additional dollars to get to the scale that you're looking for, and we'd be happy to set up additional conversations to dig in deep on any of these issues.
Hi, this is Rachel O'Leary from Los Angeles, and I just want to thank you guys for this presentation. It's really illuminating, and I thought I'd share a project that the City of LA and City Plants is about to embark on. We received a grant from the U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE as part of our urban forest management plan work. We received a grant to basically hire a municipal economic consultant to spend about 6 to 8 months creating a financing study, basically answering the question, what does a comprehensive urban forest plan look like in the city of LA? And how much will it cost to maintain trees that we want to plant, trees that we currently have? So kind of pricing, the task of the consultant that we eventually hire will be to take a look at the actual hard costs needed, and then to look at financing mechanisms on the local level to help fund a substantive urban forest for the city. We have funding for tree planting, but we don't have funding. City council and priorities, priorities have shifted over the years, and we found that green infrastructure, in terms of, especially during economic downturns, it's one of the first things to go. So our urban forest was devastated after the 2008 recession. And we're looking into, part of the plan for this financing study is to answer the question of how do we pay for it in perpetuity, and what financing mechanisms are available for that. So I'm wondering if any of your case studies look at, aside from green bonds, local financing mechanism, either a parcel tax, whatever it may be, to fund green infrastructure projects in the long term. We're basing a lot of what we're doing off of San Francisco, so I was very glad to see them use the case study here. But San Francisco actually hired Econ to do a financing study that resulted in a $19 million set-aside fund for urban forestry in perpetuity. And that's kind of what we're after here in Los Angeles. So yeah, it's less of a question, more of a ramble, but I am curious to hear if there are any local financing mechanisms that you all have looked at.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And one, I love that you guys are undertaking this, and hopefully you'll be willing to share the results or some version of the results with the whole networks. I think a lot of folks have that exact same question and maybe don't know exactly where to start. And I also love that you're thinking about not just the upfront capital costs, the need to plant trees and implement green infrastructure, but the longer term operations and maintenance. And many failures or projects that haven't gone exactly as planned, in part because they haven't properly budgeted for that longer term operations and maintenance, especially when you're talking about an urban forest that you have some publicly owned, some privately owned, commercial, so it's a whole bunch of different landowners, regulations, responsibilities, and the like. And one thing that we've also seen in terms of, from a process perspective, these types of analyses are so much more effective when they're inclusive of as many decision makers and stakeholders as possible, and they feel bought into the process, as opposed to, here it is, here are the benefits. So I'm sure that's something that you're already doing, building that consortium, but something that we found really helpful.
Yeah, we actually, on that note, just really quickly,
Please.
Sorry to interject here. So this financing study will be phase 2 of what we call the first steps toward an urban forest management plan. And we released this, we hired a consultant to take a look at, back in December, the report was released and it's available on our website. It's actually rather interesting. But basically, what does the city of LA need to get their urban forest management up to speed? And part of that process, we did a year-long working group with representatives from every major city department and city council, and nonprofit community level groups. And it was a group of about 60 people. We met once a month for a year and discussed different topics, and then released a report on all of our discussions. So we had, and one of the most critical aspects of that was each monthly meeting was led by a different stakeholder. And that really got the buy-in. So that by the end of, when the report was released, we had over 300 people attend the public release of the report, and it was really powerful. So this is phase 2 of that. The momentum's there. The buy-in, I think, is pretty much there. But this is not my personal specialty. The financing study, I'm charged with writing the RFP. And I'm a little bit lost, so.
Rachel, you're not alone. You're not alone. I mean, it's very much, so many on the urban forestry and green infrastructure side are at the early stages of a learning curve. And lots of cities and utilities have had some level of success, but I think, places like San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia, DC, Seattle, who maybe have gotten one step further, there's still so many unanswered questions and needs there. I think there's a couple of things. You asked about, long-term kind of secure funding, especially since oftentimes in downturns, that's the first thing to be cut. We've seen quite a few cities and utilities put ballot measures on ballots that are specifically focused on urban stormwater management, green space, et cetera, and have worked with communications firms to properly word and frame out those examples. And one of our partners, the Trust for Public Lands, who tracks ballot measures, they have found that something like 85% of the time, ballot measures focused on urban green space and water pass, at least in the U.S.
That's a great, I saw that and used it to convince people to support the financing study. Yeah.
And everyone, that's a strong word, but so often we hear utility managers and saying, look, raising rates is just off the table. We can't do it. We just raised rates 2 years ago, our boards. And then when we see these types of issues put to the voters, they 9 times out of 10, they pass. So one, I think we have to give our residents, our voters, more credit, that they get, making investments now is good for the long term. We know how many competing priorities there are: education, other infrastructure, healthcare, et cetera, but fortunately, water and green space generally rise to the top of the list. So whether it's a ballot measure, whether it's other types of mechanisms driven by regulation or otherwise, you are seeing more and more cities add a quasi-rate surcharge. Now, it's labeled something different in each city or each utility, depending on their local politics or realities. But in the end, the key, in my opinion, is to frame urban tree canopy, bioswales as part of the city's infrastructure, right? And we need to accomplish goals, and we can either get there by stacking bricks, or we can get there by planting trees, or ideally a hybrid of both. And if we're successful in making that frame, then we're simply investing in infrastructure. We're not investing in urban forestry. And we have seen when that frame has successfully been deployed, oftentimes the dollars flow. I also am happy to put you in touch, and this goes for everyone on the line, with a group that is focusing on the potential to generate carbon credits from the urban forest canopy. Now, some of those might be quote unquote on the California carbon exchange, but you're also seeing a lot of corporations right now operating in cities who have made a voluntary commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. as part of their stewardship plan and reporting mandate. And so they are purchasing these credits even if they're just voluntary. And that is real dollars to cover the upfront costs of tree planting, but also to cover the operations and maintenance, which is really key. We also, again, that Joint Benefits Authority project that I mentioned in San Francisco, your department shouldn't have to do this alone, right? And I'm going to use words very loosely here, like other agencies are probably free riding off the benefits that the Urban Forestry Department in LA is spending money on. Let's think about how we bring in the Department of Transportation, the Health Department, you already mentioned CAL FIRE, et cetera. All of those agencies are going to be benefiting. If we can quantify or at least order of magnitude understand what are the air quality benefits and therefore public health benefits, what are the benefits to Department of Transportation. If they just pay for the benefits that they care about and you guys pay for the ones that you care about, all of a sudden you have a lot more money flowing to the same acres or hectares of land. And Lisa Baer, who's on the line, is leading that project in San Francisco, and potentially we can have a follow-up call in the weeks ahead.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. As soon as our scope and RFP is out, I will definitely be sharing that with you. So thanks
Wonderful.
for the advice. Yeah.
Wonderful. How about others on the line? That's exactly the kind of conversation we like to have. And again, I realize this format is not perfect, but if there's a few others who want to raise something, or again, feel free to poke us afterwards and we can have a discussion.
Maybe? Yeah, this is.
Oh, please go.
David, this is David Wood of Econ. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit on a point you raised. You mentioned the insurance industry, and I'm curious if you have investigated the interest that the insurance industry may have, in particular the large insurers, in the context of stormwater quantity management using natural systems green infrastructure, that they will benefit tremendously potentially by a reduction in their claim outlay, but they won't necessarily have a reduction in their premiums. So it seems to me there would be a natural interest by them to help fund some of these upfront projects that could then improve their bottom line in the future through less payouts with better stormwater quantity management.
David, thank you for joining, and the answer is absolutely. So the project that I am most intimately involved in, where what you said has played out, verbatim, is our forest resilience bond. But I think it could be equally as pertinent for a stormwater management project. And actually, we're in conversations right now with the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, for such an approach in and around Mexico City. So just to basically repeat what you said, but expand just a little, AAA Insurance, so as many of you know, one of the largest commercial insurance companies in the United States, they are one of the market rate investors for the Forest Resilience Bond, which is focused on reducing the impacts of catastrophic wildfire. And the question is, well, why is an insurance company making an investment? And what I've heard from the director of the Northern California AAA office is there are three reasons, and this gets to your point, David. First and foremost, they hold premiums from their policyholders. So they have hundreds of millions of dollars, and what does insurance companies do? They invest those premiums, and that's how they generally make their profits. And if you're going to be getting a 4.5% per annum return, and you have AAA rated beneficiaries who are paying it back, that's a pretty good diversification and return profile for use of your proceeds. So that's point one. It's a good investment regardless of what it's for. Good due diligence there. The second, exactly what you said, by the use of the proceeds, it is reducing the likelihood of wildfire and the impacts of wildfire, and therefore reducing the likelihood of their payouts. So not only are they making money off their premiums on the front end, they're reducing the likelihood of payout on the back end. So double positive for their bottom line. And then something that I know we all complain about insurance, all the time and et cetera, but AAA is putting their money where their mouth is. And they legitimately have said the reason that they are doing this in part is because it is going to benefit not just their policyholders, where they live and work, but their staff. Their staff is living and operating in these areas of high risk. And by doing this project, they're improving the quality of life and allowing folks to sleep better at night, knowing that they're doing their part to reduce the risk. So I think it's the exact same thing for stormwater. If it's a good investment with a strong rated utility and reducing risk for payout, protecting people in their company and in their sphere of influence, it definitely makes sense. The California insurance industry has asked us to come and speak at their conference next year about this. So it's not just a one-off nice example. I think this is the new normal. And you're also looking at how the reinsurance industry might start to play a role here, which again, just dramatically increases the scale and applicability of these types of approaches.
And do you have if a city would like to investigate this as an option, do you have a suggestion of where they might start?
That is a great question. So that is my hunch. And again, I would say I would love to put you in touch with our contact in California. I know that there is an association of insurance companies. They could probably then help put you in touch with the appropriate person in your region in South Carolina. I believe that's where you are. And also, hearing it from a peer, right? Someone AAA or one of the other insurance companies in South Carolina, hearing it from one of their peers of why they did it and why it was successful is I would suspect way more influential than if I did it or even if you did it as a consultant. Happy to make that connection, David.
Thank you.
This is great. This is great. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join today. As James mentioned, this has been recorded. So within the next short period of time, we're going to have it up on the website, and we'll make sure that everyone gets a link to it. Some of these approaches, like the Joint Benefits Authority, the Forest Resilience Bond, et cetera, in the months ahead, we're going to do separate webinars just on those particular financing mechanisms with some of our partner experts to really dig into that next level of granularity and to really focus on how we can make it worthwhile for you. So just as an example, on September 10th, I'll be in Sacramento, which is also one of our Cities for Forest members, and we'll be doing a half-day workshop with about 24 Northern California utilities and municipalities around the Forest Resilience Bond, focused specifically on how it might work for them. We've had conversations, I believe Jaya from our India office is on the line. We've had conversations about organizing workshops in India, really focused specifically on their context in South Asia. Similarly, our partners in Mexico and Colombia and Brazil, we've talked to the IDB about doing this type of workshop and bringing our cities to the table to really understand what they need, what they want, and how jointly we might be able to make this a reality. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Feel free to reach out with any questions. There are resources on the website for most of these projects I described, and I greatly look forward to engaging with you in the months and the years ahead. So thank you so much, and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I've also put my email address in the chat window, james.anderson@wi.org. Feel free to reach out if you want to get in touch with Todd or learn anything more. Thank you all for joining.